Right, it is Mrs. Brown here. I am not at school today, but I want to make sure that we get our read aloud in. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. Make sure you're following along. I will stop at different times and talk about some stuff, so make sure you pay attention to that because you are going to do a reading response when we get to the end of the class. All right. So the family just had to sell off all of their hogs because the government said that they are too stinky for the people behind them. This is a really big disaster for the family because that's how they make the majority of their money. Grain prices are down, hogs were how they made their money, and now all the hogs are gone. Okay, so we're on chapter 6. The tax bill arrived 2 weeks later, the day that Dad, Matthew, and Mark loaded the hogs onto the livestock trailer and took them all away. Most were going to the slaughterhouse. The ones too young and too small to bring a decent price were going to an auction for feeder pigs. Luke watched through the vent at the front of the house as Dad drove by in the battered pickup with each load. Matthew and Mark sat in the back of the pickup, making sure the trailer stayed hitched right. Even 3 stories up, Luke could see Matthew's hangdog expression. The fact that they had to make multiple loads, that lets me know that this is a lot of hogs that they had to get rid of. This is probably a lot of money, main part of their way that they make their money. Then, when the 3 of them came into the house for dinner, after washing the last of the hog smell off their hands in the mudroom, Dad handed Mother the tax bill without comment. She put down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the stew and unfolded the letter. Then she dropped it. "Why, that's—" She seemed to be doing the math in her head as she bent to retrieve it. "That's 3 times what it usually is. There must be a mistake." Dad shook his head grimly. "No mistake. I talked to Williker at the auction." The Willikers were their nearest neighbors, with a house 3 miles down the road. Luke always pictured them with monster scales and fierce claws because of the number of times he'd been cautioned, "You don't want the Willikers to see you." My guess is the reason that he sees them this way is because the Willikers are the ones that they hear about the most because they're the closest, so they're also the most likely to see Luke. But if they were to see Luke, they were also the most likely to turn him in. Okay, right here where Dad went on. Dad went on, "Williker says they raised everyone's taxes because of them fancy houses. Makes our land worth more." "Isn't that good?" Luke asked eagerly. It was strange. He should hate the new houses for replacing his woods and forcing him to stay indoors. But he'd half fallen in love with them, having watched every foundation poured, every wooden skeleton of walls and roofs raised to the sky. They were his main entertainment, aside from talking to Mother when she came upstairs for what she called my Luke breaks. Sometimes she pretended his room needed cleaning as badly as the bread needed baking or the garden needed weeding. Sometimes she just sat and talked. Dad was shaking his head in disgust over Luke's question. "No, it's only good if we're selling, and we ain't. All it means for us is that the government thinks they can get more money out of us." Matthew was slumped on his chair in the table. "How are we going to pay?" he asked. "That's more than we got for all the hogs, and that was supposed to carry us through for a long time." Dad didn't answer. Even Mark, who normally had a smart alecky comeback for everything, was stupefied. I'm going to go right back here to where it talks about taxes. So the way taxes work is you have land that's worth a certain amount of money, and you get taxed at a certain rate. So if your land is worth more money, you get taxed more. When their farm was not near anything, their land was worth a certain amount, so their taxes were kind of what they expected. Because they're building these brand new huge houses near them, that makes their land worth more. If their land is worth more, they also have to pay more taxes, which they weren't expecting. So this, added on to the fact that they just lost all of their hogs, is making their situation even worse. All right. Mother had turned back to her stew. "I got my work permit today," she said softly. "The factory's hiring. If I can get on there, I can maybe get an advance on my paycheck." Luke's jaw dropped. "You can't go to work," he said. "Who will—" He wanted to say, "Who will stay with me? Who will I talk to all day when everyone else is outside?" But that seemed too selfish. Luke looked around. No one else looked surprised by Mother's news. He shut his mouth. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of an inference here. Some of these things that have been happening, like nobody being surprised by this, lets me know that the family's probably talking about it. But Luke doesn't understand that this is happening, and a big part of it is he doesn't even really get to be part of the family anymore since he has to stay back from the dinner table and he can't hear what they're talking about, and they talk about things when he's not gone. So Luke is part of the family, but he's not being part of all these conversations that the family is having about how they're going to survive. All right, we're going to keep going with chapter 7. By mid-September, Luke's days had fallen into a familiar pattern. He got up at dawn just for the chance to sit on the stairs and watch the rest of his family eat breakfast. They all rushed now. Mother had to be at the factory by 7. Dad was trying to get all the machinery in working order before harvest. And Matthew and Mark were back in school. Only Luke had time to linger over his undercooked bacon and dry toast. He didn't bother asking for butter because that meant someone would have to stand up and bring it over to him, all the while pretending for the sake of the open window that they'd just forgotten something upstairs. As soon as the rest of his family had stomped out the door, Luke went back to his room and watched out the vents. First out the front to see Matthew and Mark climb onto the school bus, then out the back where the new houses were practically finished. They were mansions, as large as their Garner's house and barn put together. They gleamed in the morning sunlight as though their walls were studded with precious jewels. For all Luke knew, maybe they were. Hordes of workmen still arrived every morning, but almost all of them worked indoors now. They headed into the houses first thing, carrying rolls of carpet, stacks of drywall, cans of paint. Luke couldn't see much of them after that. He spent more time now watching a new kind of traffic. Expensive-looking cars driving slowly down the newly paved streets. Sometimes they pulled into a driveway and went into one of the houses, usually trailing a woman who appeared to be talking nonstop. It had taken Luke a while to figure it out. He certainly hadn't dared ask anyone else in his family, but he thought maybe the people were thinking about buying the houses. Once he realized that, he studied each potential neighbor carefully. He'd overheard Mother and Dad marveling that the people moving into the new houses were not just going to be city people, but barons. Barons were unbelievably rich, Luke knew. They had things ordinary people hadn't had in years. Luke wasn't sure how the barons had gotten rich when everybody else was poor, but Dad never said the word baron without a curse word or two in front of it. Okay, the fact that this word baron is here and the way they describe them lets me think that this group, these people, have the way they live is kind of divided into groups. There are the people who are very, very rich and the people who are very, very poor. And it's not just rich and poor. These people who are rich actually have a title and they're called barons. So these houses that they built in their backyard are not just regular houses. These are huge mansions and these are very rich people moving in behind them. All right. The people streaming through the houses did look different from anyone in Luke's family. They were mostly thin, beautiful women in form-fitting dresses and heavy-set men in what Luke's dad and brothers called sissy clothes, shiny shoes and clean, dressy pants and jackets. Luke always felt a little embarrassed for them, showing up like that. Or maybe he was embarrassed for his family, that they never looked like any of the barons. Luke preferred it when the adults had children with them, and he could concentrate on them. The smallest ones were always as dressed up as their parents, with hair bows and suspenders and other gewgaws. Luke knew his parents would never buy. The older kids usually seemed to be wearing whatever they'd grabbed first out of their closet that morning. Though he knew no one would dare show up with 3 kids, he always counted. 1, 2. 1. 1, 2. What if a family with just 1 kid moved in behind them and he sneaked into their house and pretended to be a second child? He could go to school, go to town, act like Matthew and Mark. What a joke. Luke living with barons. More likely he'd be shot for trespassing. Or turned in. When he began thinking things like that, he always jumped down from his perch by the vent and grabbed a book from one of the dusty stacks by the eaves. Mother had taught him to read and do math as much as she knew herself. "At least we have a few books for you," she often mumbled sadly when she left in the morning. He'd read all their books dozens of times, even the ones with titles like Diseases of the Porcine Species and Common Grasses of Our Countryside. These would be books, so grasses of the area, like for harvesting hay, and then porcine is another word for pork. So this book is basically about pig diseases. His favorites were the handful of adventure books, the ones that let him pretend he was a knight fighting a dragon to rescue a kidnapped princess, or an explorer sailing on the high seas, holding tight to a mast while a hurricane raged about him. He liked to forget that he was Luke Garner, third child, hidden in the attic. Sometime around noon, he'd hear the door from the mudroom to the kitchen swing open, and he'd go down and eat at the same time as his dad. Without Mother, there were no homemade pies now, no mashed potatoes, no roasts that sent good smells throughout the house. Dad always made 4 sandwiches, checked to make sure no one could see him, then handed 2 of them to Luke in the stairwell. Dad never talked. He'd explain that he didn't want anyone overhearing him and wondering. But he did turn the radio on for the noon farm report, and there was usually a song or two after that before Dad silenced the radio and went outside to work again. When Dad left, Luke went back to his room to read or watch the houses again. At 6:30, Mother came home, and she always stopped in and said hi to Luke before rushing out to do a whole day's work in the few hours before bedtime. Usually Matthew or Mark came up to visit him too, but they could never stay long either. They had to help Dad before supper, then do homework afterwards, and they always had been nicest to Luke outdoors. Before the woods came down, the 3 of them often had played kickball or football or spud in the backyard after school and chores. Matthew and Mark always fought about who got to have Luke on his team, because even if Luke wasn't very good, 2 boys together could always beat the third. Now they played half-hearted games of cards or checkers with Luke, and Luke could tell they'd rather be outside. So would he. He tried not to think about it. The best part of the day came at the end, when Mother tucked him in. She'd be relaxed then. She'd stay for an hour sometimes, asking him what he'd read that day or telling him stories about the factory. Then one night, when she was telling how her plastic glove had gotten stuck in a chicken she'd degutted that day, Mother suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Mother?" Luke said. She answered with a snore. She'd fallen asleep, sitting up. Luke studied her face, seeing lines of fatigue that hadn't been there before, noticing that the hair around her face now held as much gray as brown. This word fatigue right here means like extreme exhaustion. Okay, so Mother is getting up and leaving at 7, going to the factory, working and degutting chickens, and then coming home and having to do all the work that she missed out on before. And then on top of that, she's going and spending an hour with Luke. And she is so tired, she literally fell asleep while she was talking. "All right. Mother," he said again, gently shaking her arm. She jerked. "But I cleaned that chicken up." "Oh, sorry, Luke. You need tucking in, don't you?" She fluffed his pillow, smoothed his sheet. Luke sat up. "That's okay, Mother. I'm getting too old for this He swallowed a lump in his throat. "Anyway, I bet you weren't still tucking Matthew or Mark in when they were 12. "No," she said quietly. "Then I don't need it either." "Okay," she said. She kissed his forehead anyhow, then turned out the light. Luke turned his face to the wall until she left. So my guess is, I'm going to make another inference here, that Mother didn't tuck Matthew and Mark in until they were 12, but she's still doing it with Luke because Luke doesn't get to have really any other contact with her. So this is kind of her way to spend some time with him. All right. Thank you for reading along. Do a nice job. Make sure you keep it up and make sure you behave yourselves. Bye.